Hi, class. Welcome back to our continued series on chapter reviews for the American Yawp textbook. Now, today we're getting into Chapter 9. This is Democracy in America, and this chapter is going to focus on the rise of democratic ideals, the expansion of voting rights, and the era of Andrew Jackson. The 19th century saw dramatic shifts in American politics as power begins to shift away from elites into the hands of the common man. We see the rise of a new political party and the death of the era of good feelings, that period of time where we just had one real political party, the National Republicans. And the National Republicans are still going to be around, but they're going to fracture. And so really what we see in this time period is the creation of several new political parties. And so we'll get into that as we move through the conversation. Now, at the heart of the democratic revolution of the early 19th century, the early 1800s in America, was the expansion of the electorate. During this period, most states moved to eliminate property requirements for voting, and it allowed for a much broader segment of white men to participate in elections. This was a major shift from the early republic, where voting was largely limited to property-owning elites. So before this, if you were a white male property owner, then you were able to vote. But if you worked for somebody else, if you were an indentured servant or maybe a freed indentured servant that rather than getting land continued to seek employment with others, then you were excluded from the right to vote. Well, it becomes harder to do that as more people are moving into factories and starting to work in factories and drawing weekly or daily paychecks. So how do we determine who is a rightful voter? Well, we expand the voting to basically all white men, and we call this universal white manhood suffrage. And so this is a major shift that's taking place. And as a result, we see more working class citizens gaining political power, and political landscape becomes much more diverse. However, it's important to remember that this expansion of democracy did not extend to everyone. Women, African Americans, Native Americans, they are not included in this expansion. We are moving in the right direction, but we haven't gotten to where suffrage is universal to American citizens. So there are some limits to this, and that reflects some of the limits, and we'll see some other things as we move through. Now, Andrew Jackson will become a symbol of this new democratic era. He's a hero of the War of 1812, Battle of New Orleans specifically. Jackson was seen as a champion of the common man. His rise to power was fueled by his appeal to voters who felt left out of the political system. And this would include farmers and frontiersmen and other urban workers and various other groups such as that. Now, in 1824, Jackson loses the election. It is a crazy one, and I'll see if I can't put a video together that illustrates this a little bit more as we start to move through this conversation more. But for now, this is what I want you to know. He loses in 24. He's going to fight throughout the term of President John Quincy Adams. He's going to fight that whole time, running a campaign to win in 1828. He does this. And some of the things he does to get his support together is form a new political party, and this will become the Democrat Party. The same Democrat Party we see today, although their views change, as all parties do, as we move through time. So in the election of 1828, Jackson is going to show his populist appeal. It's going to be very evident that the people are excited about Jackson. He ran against incumbent John Quincy Adams. He portrayed himself as a man of the people, fighting against corruption and elite interest. And his victory is going to mark the beginning of what is often called Jacksonian democracy. It's a movement that sought to empower ordinary Americans to expand democratic participation. So again, we're kind of limiting that right now to white men. But again, we're laying the foundation for other expansions with black male voters after the Civil War, and then women get the right to vote in the early 1920s. And so we do, and Native Americans in the 1920s as well. Hopefully I got those dates right. Now, Jackson's presidency wasn't just about expanding democracy, okay? It brought hopes. It brought significant changes, not hopes, but it brought significant changes to how politics was conducted. One of the most controversial policies that Jackson introduces is called a spoils system, and it's a war term. Spoils were when you captured something from the enemy. To the victor go the spoils. And so the spoils system, or patronage system as it's often called as well, Jackson would reward his political supporters with government jobs, and it was a practice that reflected Jackson's belief that government positions should be open to all citizens and not just a privileged few. So while this system increased access to government and government jobs for ordinary Americans, ordinary citizens, it also led to a widespread accusations, plural, of corruption and cronyism, playing favorites, buying your way into a job. Nevertheless, it became a hallmark of Jacksonian politics. It emphasized loyalty and partisan awards, and it would remain a major policy of both parties all the way into the 1880s. And we actually see a president assassinated in large measure because of this. Garfield is shot because an individual didn't get a job that he thought he should have after he was elected in the 1880 election, 1880. Now, the next conversation we need to get into is nullification. And I do need to kind of call back to an event of the late Adams administration. And that would be the Kentucky and Virginia resolves. What did those things call for? Thomas Jefferson, James Madison said that if the federal government passes a law that violates the constitutional rights of a state, the state should have the right to basically not follow that law, not collect those taxes, or whatever the case may be. Now, this was prior to judicial review. Judicial review kind of changes things, but the concept is still out there, the principle is still out there, and we're about to see it put into, well, at least conceivably put into practice. So the nullification crisis is going to illustrate the growing tension between federal authority and states' rights. This happens in 1832. It's a key moment when South Carolina, led by Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, mentioned him before, war hawk during the War of 1812, important member of the Senate prior to becoming vice president. Calhoun is going to declare that the state of South Carolina, or any state for that matter, had the right to nullify federal tariffs. Jackson was a strong believer in union. He rejected the challenge to federal authority, and he threatened to use military force to enforce the law. So why was this issue of tariffs such a big deal? Maybe I'll make a video on that specifically with more details, but the short answer is this was a huge tariff that supported the industrial manufacturing interests of the North, but it harmed the interests of the South. If you're a farmer and you've got to buy a product, if you've got to buy maybe a plow, and you're going to buy it from England for $5, and you could buy it from a northern factory for $7, you're going to buy it for $5. Well, the tariff raises the price on that foreign product to maybe $8 or $9, $10. Well, now you're forced to buy it from an American manufacturer, but you're still paying more. And plus, if you're going to start putting tariffs on foreign countries, well, that means they maybe start putting tariffs on your farm products. And who's buying much of the southern cotton? England and places such as that. So again, the South feels like it's not being treated equally in this union. And Jackson opposes or rejects the idea of secession. He says that the union cannot be undermined. And it's going to be something somewhat echoed by Abraham Lincoln a few years in the future. Now, the crisis is eventually going to be resolved with a compromise tariff. Congress comes back together and they say, we will lower the rates on this tariff if you will reject the nullification doctrine, South Carolina's exposition and protest. So if you'll reject that, then we will bring down the tariffs. And then they do. They work through it. Now, Jackson took a strong stance against nullification. It showed that he is a supporter of states' rights, as we will see in some of his economic policies, but he also shows a strong belief in union. Now, one of the hallmarks of Jackson's presidency is going to be his stance on the national bank. Well, Mr. Ford, I thought we got rid of the national bank. Hamilton had instituted the first national bank, and then it dies during the War of 1812. Well, it would have been a good thing to have during wartime, so we passed a new national bank, the second national bank, around about 1816. Well, by the time we get to Jackson's second term, that bank is nearing the end of its sunset. It's not going to go on forever. It has to be renewed. Well, Jackson has said quite often that he is not in favor of this national bank. He's very Jeffersonian in that respect. So Jackson's fight against the national bank is going to define particularly his second term. Jackson believed that the bank was a tool of the wealthy elite and that held way too much power over the economy. And in 1832, he vetoed a bill to recharter the bank, and the charter was launched early, hoping that maybe there was support to override a veto, but there wasn't that support in the Congress. And he's going to frame this battle to kill the bank as a battle against economic inequality and corruption as well. Now, Jackson's bank war is going to lead to the removal of the federal deposits from the bank. It's going to place them in smaller pet banks, and it's a move that destabilizes the economy in the short term. Now, while Jackson's supporters praised the efforts to bring down a corrupt institution, his critics are going to argue that his policies contributed to the economic stability that would lead us to the Panic of 1837. And in those days, a depression, what we would call a depression today, was called a panic back then. It's a severe financial crisis that occurred shortly after he left office, and we can debate how much responsibility he has and how much his successor, Martin Van Buren, will have. And that's an argument that, that the historians make on both sides. But one of the most tragic, controversial aspects of Jackson's presidency, moving on, was the policy of Indian removal. And the Indian Removal Act of 1830 is going to authorize the forced relocation of Native American tribes from the southeast into lands west of the Mississippi River. Now, Jackson argued this was necessary to open up lands for American settlers to prevent conflict between settlers and Native peoples. And he also goes on to say that this is to preserve the cultures of those Native Americans. So if you go and you read his 1829 address to Congress, he's got some interesting arguments in there, and we can decide whether to take him at face value or not. But this leads us into the famous Trail of Tears. It was the forced march of the Cherokee Nation in 1838. Now, other tribes had moved west prior, but the last to sort of move would be the Cherokees. And that Jackson's not president anymore. He's been out of office for about 2 years. But during that march, which took place mostly in winter, many of the Cherokee are going to die during this relocation. And the event remains a dark chapter in this story. And Jackson saw it as a way to secure American expansion. He came as an immense cost to to Native Americans as well. Now, not all Native Americans will be relocated. There's still a large reservation just on the western border of North Carolina, in the town of Cherokee, right in the middle of it. And been through there a number of times. So, how can we conclude this video? The era of Jacksonian democracy, it's a time of significant change, especially in American politics. And Jackson's presidency is going to mark the rise of a more inclusive democracy for white men particularly, and the empowerment of the ordinary citizen, and the shift in political power away from elites. Now, it also exposed deep divisions over issues like states' rights, economic policies, Native American removal. I would even argue that we start to see some seeds of civil war right here. Now, they go back farther, but we're starting to see the discontent that will become the Civil War. South Carolina saying, listen, we feel like we are being ill-used by the Union. Why do the northern cities and the northern states have tariffs that benefit them that harm us? So the legacy of Jacksonian democracy is complex. It expands democratic participation for some. It also reinforces a certain amount of inequality that we see throughout society, but it sets a stage for future conflicts also over the balance of power between the federal government and the states. So thanks for joining me. This is very abbreviated, and hopefully I can make some other short videos dealing with some of the topics like the election of 1824, the election of 1828, the Nullification Crisis. And so keep a look out for those, possibly in my deep dive series. But hopefully this has been helpful. If so, give me a thumbs up, and I will see you next time. Good luck with your studies. Good luck with your tests. Bye-bye.